You're listening to the Sass Says podcast. I'm your host, Christy Rocha, also known as Sass. I identify as a woman, a wife, and a mother. That should tell you a lot already. And over the last few years, I've learned the value of talk therapy. I have seen how my inner work not only enhances my own well-being, but also my marriage, my parenting, my relationships. And in fact, you wouldn't be hearing this right now if it weren't for the work I've done. My mission is to debunk the misconceptions and stigmas around what therapy is and who it's for. Let's normalize working on our mental health and seeking help when needed. We've all heard of self-care, self-help, and self-love, but do you often wonder how to actually make it all happen? I do. You'll hear strategy-based conversations with professionals, as well as inspiring and validating stories from women who are just like you and me. Think of this podcast as the weekly therapy sessions you didn't know you needed, with a dash of sass, a lot of vulnerability, and me, relentlessly asking, but how? Hey. Okay, so today I am joined by Dr. Alexis Conason, clinical psychologist and certified eating disorder specialist-supervisor in New York City. Her group practice, Conason Psychological Services, specializes in the treatment of binge eating disorders, disordered eating, body image concerns, and the psychological issues related to bariatric weight loss surgery. Dr. Conason is also the founder of the Anti-Diet Plan, a weight-inclusive online mindful eating program designed to help people stop dieting, eat more attuned with their body, and live a more peaceful and pleasurable life. She's the author of The Diet-Free Revolution, 10 Steps to Free Yourself from the Diet Cycle with Mindful Eating and Radical Self-Acceptance. Dr. Conason is a fierce advocate for helping people recognize and question the societal norms that encourage feeling not good enough about themselves so they can stop fixating on shrinking their bodies and reclaim the space that they deserve in the world. And I can absolutely confirm that she does just that. I wouldn't call this episode necessarily the start of a series because I won't be playing them in order, but it was certainly the beginning of a journey for me, and I think you'll hear that. There are more episodes coming that you will hear me have shifts in my learning and understanding, especially when it comes to my personal journeys with food, exercise, and body image. Dr. Conason and I talk extensively about diet culture, where it comes from, and how it is harmful. We talk about mindful eating, disordered eating, eating disorders, and weight stigma. We talk quite a bit about how to talk to our children about food and what we can do for the next generation when it comes to absolutely dismantling diet culture. Dr. Conason shares her advice for creating a meditation mindfulness practice and how we can show ourselves more self-compassion. I was deeply moved by this conversation, and it propelled a continued interest to learn about my own food and body story, as well as an interest in taking a look at the bigger picture of dieting, food, and exercise. As usual, more thoughts to come after the show. Hi, Dr. Conason. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
I shared with you off air that I'm very excited to speak with you, but I'm also a little bit anxious. I feel like this is a very relevant topic in my life at the moment, so I appreciate you taking the time, and I'm hoping to, I know I will be learning right along with anyone listening today.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so I think where I'd like to start is especially because it's so relevant to me at the moment. You know, when we talk about diet culture and just body image, weight, health, there's so much shame, guilt, even self-hatred that comes along with everything I just rattled off. Where do those beliefs come from, in your opinion? Why do I feel that way?
Well, I think that diet culture, it's a very ingrained part of our culture, and it gets internalized. And part of the foundation of what diet culture does is it makes us believe that we're not good enough. So it makes us feel that if we're not conforming to some very narrow ideal that's impossible for the vast majority of us to ever meet, that somehow we're doing something wrong, that that's a moral failing on our part. We're not trying hard enough. We're not doing good enough. And that it elicits a lot of guilt and shame. Which, again, I think that kind of is the idea of diet culture. Diet culture is designed to make people opt out of life, really, in terms of when shame is a feeling that makes us want to hide and kind of run away from things. And it stops us from engaging fully in our lives. And I think that's kind of the point of it.
Yeah, I feel like I am that person that sits there and says, when I lose the weight, I'll feel better. And actually, so I'm about a year and a half postpartum with my second right now. And I'm in the process of kind of putting myself out there with different mom groups, and my older daughter is starting school, and I actually catch myself not wanting to introduce myself to other mothers because I'm not in a body that I recognize for myself. So I guess where I'm kind of coming from with that is that feeling of being put on pause, of coming, like you said, just waiting for life to start, or so maybe you didn't say it right now. I think I heard you say it somewhere else, but what do you say to people you work with? How do we start? Where do we begin the process of healing that?
So I think we start right where we are because there's nowhere else that we can be. And it's really a process of kind of just identifying those thoughts, recognizing where they're coming from, and choosing to move forward with self-compassion, with self-acceptance. I think that thoughts can be there, and they will be there because it's so pervasive in our culture, this kind of indoctrination to like self-hatred that we all go through, especially people socialized as girls and women in our culture. And it's a hard process to unlearn, but I do think that the starting point is acceptance of where we are right now and trying to find ways to move forward with compassion.
Yeah, I've heard you say that accepting ourselves is where change begins. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think a lot of us believe falsely that it's like self-criticism and self-hatred that motivates us. So like if we can just be really hard on ourselves, if we just like criticize ourselves all the time, if we berate ourselves nonstop, then somehow that's going to motivate us to make the changes in our life. And it couldn't be further from the truth, because that's actually what makes us feel really stuck. We get overwhelmed with just like these negative feelings and shame, guilt, all of those kinds of things that make us feel stuck. Like we want to opt out, we want to hide, we want to disengage. And a lot of people see self-acceptance as giving up. Like if I accept myself the way that I am, well, isn't that just like saying it doesn't matter? I am, I'm destined to live a life where I don't feel good about myself. I'm just, giving up. And I think that it's totally the opposite, because when we accept ourselves as we are in the current moment, we can start to embrace embrace where we are with a sense of compassion, and that that sense of like nurturing is where change occurs. And we see this all the time with kids. Sometimes I think it's really clear if we take it away from ourselves and look at like an example with children. But if we as a parent just yelled at our kids all day and like pointed out every mistake that they made and screamed at them when they fell down, or, they would be traumatized. Like they would be really scared, and they wouldn't be developing in a healthy way. They wouldn't be moving forward in life. They would be terrified of the world, which is what we see with abused, which is often what we see with abused kids. But when we show our children love and compassion and build up their strengths and just try to nurture them to be the best that they can be, that's where change occurs. And that's where kids start to strive towards, towards being their best. And the same thing applies to us. So, when we're just berating ourselves all the time, we really are stuck in that place of self-criticism, and we don't want to, do anything or change or do things that help us feel better. But when we can try to shift to a place of self-love, and when I say self-love, I don't mean love what you look like, but I mean love yourself the way that you would love your child, like with a deep, unconditional love, a love that's not about like what we look like or what our body's doing, but a sense, kind of a fundamental sense that we are worthy, that we are good enough, that we are deserving of care and kindness. And that is often, I find like the best place to start a path forward.
And I want to ask you to elaborate maybe on what that practice of acceptance might actually look like in a day-to-day scenario. But I want to say that what you just said reminded me of two things. One, I don't know if you've read, it's called Burnout. The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Code. I can't recall the author's name at the moment, but she says exactly that, to treat yourself and your body as if you were a newborn baby. Am I lonely? Am I hungry? Am I tired? Do I need a change of environment? Just not assuming the worst of yourself. But also I want to share, because I'm a pretty self-aware person, I would say, for the most part. I've also been in therapy for a few years now. And even today, I was changing the garbage bag, and I had just eaten like a mini bagel. And as I'm changing the garbage bag, I'm thinking to myself, you shouldn't have eaten that mini bagel. You weren't that hungry for it. And I dropped the bag, because if I wasn't preparing for this interview with you, I don't know that I would have even noticed that I had those thoughts. And I think that that's been a real aha moment for me in the last few weeks, and honestly, just in the last few days of preparing to speak with you and really immersing myself in what you do, is that we hear a lot of what you're saying fairly often if you're looking for it. But I'm coming around to that it happens so passively as well, that it's almost unconsciously happening constantly. Like when you think of, and I'll get off my tangent in a second here, but when I hear people say, when they talk about a negative voice in our heads or things, I don't know why, but I immediately sort of think about a person who must just sit down at the couch and go, I'm going to talk like crap to myself right now. You're terrible. You don't deserve anything. You ate like garbage today. And it's, at least in my experience, I never do that. But it's just when I'm moving and grooving throughout the day that these sort of passive thoughts are just running through my brain, and I forget about them like it's nothing, but they're there and they're making an impression. So if you have anything to add to that, please do. And then I would also love for you to go back to just in practicing reframing our mindset, in practicing self-care, self-acceptance, and self-love. Like, how on a Tuesday could I be like, okay, I'm going to put time and attention to this right now? What would that look like?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with what you shared about just like how these thoughts are kind of going on all day, often outside of our awareness. And I think that is the most problematic part about them, is that they are happening outside of our, they're happening without us even realizing that they're happening. It's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to, sit down on my couch now and for 45 minutes, I'm going to talk about myself. Few of us would consciously, intentionally make that choice. But instead what happens is it's this kind of background noise that is happening outside of our awareness. And when something's happening outside of our awareness, we're not making choices about it. We're not, it's happening in a reactionary kind of way, and we can't change anything that we're not aware of, right? So awareness is the first step to change. And that's why a lot of what I teach and what I talk about in my book has a foundation of mindfulness meditation, because mindfulness is the skill or the practice, I should say, that helps us build awareness. I mean, in essence, that's what mindfulness, it's awareness. It's becoming fully aware and present in the current moment. And when we build a meditation practice, a mindfulness practice, and it doesn't have to be like sitting for 20 minutes or, going to like a meditation center or anything like that. It can be very practical and it can fit into our daily lives easily. But when we start to build that meditation practice, that mindfulness practice, we start to be more aware of those thoughts, exactly like you noticed today. You start to say, oh my gosh, I'm being really hard on myself right now. Or, wow, listen to these things that I'm saying to myself. Would I ever say those things to my child, to a pet, to a stranger, right? Most of the things that we say to ourselves, we wouldn't even say to like our worst enemies. Right? If we said it to a child, it would probably be considered abuse. It's really, intense how we talk about ourselves, and most of us don't even realize we're doing it. And that's the part that I think is so hard. So, the first step I would say is to try to bring more awareness to it in terms of like how to be more accepting and how to be more compassionate towards ourselves. It's really about recognizing that dialogue, using meditation or mindfulness skills to focus ourselves on the present moment. So to be able to see those thoughts and not be in them, so to speak, like that I think that's such a great example when you're taking out the garbage, because that's exactly what it is. It's kind of recognizing those thoughts, pausing, saying, oh my gosh, what am I saying to myself? Or, right, like listen to this voice. And then, self-compassion is really how do I want to move forward? So there's no one answer of like what self-compassion looks like, but it is kind of coming to yourself rather than, saying, oh, what's wrong with you? Like I was trying to be more compassionate towards myself, and here I am beating myself up, right? Which we get into a lot when we start looking at self-compassion.
Totally. Yes.
To be able to say, okay, listen to that dialogue. I'm really being hard on myself. I wonder what's going on right now, where I'm having a hard time. I must be struggling right now if I'm talking to myself in this way. What do I really need? Right. And I think that what do I really need part is the part that differs a lot, for each person. It might be, calling and speaking to a friend. It might be, taking some time to just do something that's really enjoyable in your day. It might be just sitting with those feelings. I think a lot of the time we kind of are like, one of the most common things that I get with my clients is that they're like, okay, I recognize that I, am having a hard time, or that I'm feeling anxious or feeling sad. Now what do I do? Like, how do I make those feelings go away? And
go to therapy.
I think go to therapy, right? Step one, they're doing. But also, part of what we're going to say in therapy is that life isn't always comfortable. Like sometimes those uncomfortable feelings are just something that we have to get through. And we have the resiliency, and you can, therapy is going to help build resiliency and strength and coping to get through those feelings. But, wherever we started to believe that we can like get through life, like feeling happy all the time and like never feel sad or worried or anything like that, is a little bit of a myth, right? Because like John Kabat-Zinn, who's one of the people, a big name in the mindfulness world, and one of the people who's most credited with bringing mindfulness meditation into Western medical settings. His book is called Full Catastrophe Living. That's one of his early books. And I love the title because it really speaks to what mindfulness is. It's about leaning into life. It's about recognizing that we're not going to be able to really experience joy without also experiencing sadness. We are opening ourselves to the full range of human emotions. Emotions, I will say, are different than, like a mood disorder or something like that. So while moments of sadness are inevitable, if you are feeling, prolonged periods of depression or anxiety or something like that, that is not something that you just have to endure and get through. That's something you can get help with.
Yeah. I was laughing a little bit while you were talking because frequently throughout the early stages of my therapy, my therapist had to constantly remind me that I'm going to feel things
Yeah.
Like she's like, you're a human, you're going
Yeah.
to feel. And she's like, I constantly feel like your objective is to just like not feel anything about a situation. I'm like, yeah, well, I don't want to, it's too much work. But
Yeah.
it's part of the process. And often I find that through any process, whether it's now kind of going down this journey of my own body image and all of that, it often starts to feel icky before it feels quote unquote better, because you really,
Hmm.
at least for me, I uncover things I didn't even realize were there.
Hmm.
um
Exactly. And that's therapy's marketing problem. That like
yes.
you'll feel worse before you feel better. But it is part of the process because, a lot of people come to therapy where they've been tuning out of things. They've been
Mm,
using, a lot of like maladaptive coping strategies to numb themselves. And in a way that works, but in another way that doesn't work. And I always say, if you're coming into therapy, there's something that's not working because, if you were doing it so great, then you wouldn't be here.
right.
Not that there's any, I think everyone should come to therapy. Obviously, I'm a huge proponent of therapy, but, sometimes these coping skills that they have benefits and they also have cost to them. Um, and part of therapy is recognizing that like we don't want to feel numb all the
Yeah.
time. It's that feelings are part of being human.
Yeah. And I'm feeling like that may be a nice transition to my question of, what is it about food? What is it about eating that so many of us feel is a proper coping mechanism? Why is that correlation there? Why isn't it that when I feel like crap, I want to go do, I don't know, I have to tell myself I should go do yoga? It's not just the immediate of, well, I want to eat ice cream. Like, what is that connection about?
Well, I think that food can be a very effective coping mechanism. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with using food, to cope. What I think becomes problematic is when food is the only thing that we use to
Mm,
cope and we don't have other tools in the toolbox, so to speak, because our emotions, again, it goes back to the idea that like our emotions are important sources of communication. And if we're kind of tamping down our emotions all the time, whether it's with food or with yoga. And we see this with people, getting into compulsive
I was
exercise,
just
which can
thinking
be,
that, yeah.
yeah, just as problematic. Like it's taking away our ability to sit with our feelings and to understand like what it is that we're experiencing and what it is that we truly need, because oftentimes our emotions are a way of saying like there's something going on that needs tending to,
Mm,
whether it is just kind of rest or needing to connect with others or needing more pleasure in our life or recognizing areas of distress, whatever it is, like they're important sources of communication. When we're just kind of constantly pushing them away, first of all, we're not hearing what they're communicating, and second of all, they become very overwhelming because it
yeah.
kind of is like that. I like to give the analogy of like a kid who's scared of the monster under their bed. And, when we're not looking at something, we build it up into this really scary thing that we get, we're almost more scared of looking at it than the actual experience. So,
Hmm.
what happens with a kid who's scared of a monster under their bed is like, hopefully like a caregiver comes in with a flashlight and is like, hey, look at what's under the bed. It's actually just like a pile of your clothes and your, beloved stuffy or something. And, and then the fear goes away, but it's that mounting, sense of anxiety of like, what could it be? And I think that tends to happen with our feelings too, when we get into these habitual patterns of pushing our emotions away. We're like, oh my gosh, what is that really big, scary thing looming over us?
Hmm.
So, in my mind, that's the biggest issue with using food to cope with emotional feelings, is that we're just not always dealing with the root of like what's going on emotionally. And, different feelings call for different coping strategies. So when we only have one thing that we're going to for everything, whether it's food or alcohol
Interesting.
or exercise or anything, it
Hmm.
can become problematic. But I also, I say that to say that there's a lot of demonization, I think, of like quote unquote emotional eating in our culture, where we say like, we should never eat emotionally. We should only eat when we're hungry. Food should be fuel, and this whole mentality. And that's like also not really how people eat. Like when people, even people who have a, normal, quote unquote, normal or healthy relationship with food, which is sadly not that many of us
Yeah.
because we're being, all being kind of swimming in this very disordered culture. But a healthy relationship with food includes eating when we're not hungry for like emotional reasons, whether it's to cope with something upsetting that happened or to celebrate a birthday and have a slice of cake because the cake looks delicious and you want to join in that experience with friends and family. That's emotional eating too, or, having something because it tastes delicious and you want to enjoy it. Like that's all part of normal eating. So I think that I would caution against kind of demonizing emotional eating because it is like it can help to get through the moment. And, in the scheme of, the range of different things that people use to cope, it's, one of the kind of the lower risk ones, if we look at, drugs, alcohol, other kinds of things that people do.
I have so many follow-up questions.
Mhm.
I don't even know where to
Yeah.
start. I think because this is perhaps, so what is the difference, I guess, between an eating disorder and disordered eating? Because you touched on it there, and it's something that I've really been exploring because short of being a doctor, I can pretty much almost nearly 100% guarantee that I do not and have not suffered or battled an eating disorder. But I'm really exploring if I have some sort of relationship with food that is not entirely healthy. Like, and I'm wondering where we start to cross over into places where we would put terminology on them.
So, I mean, technically speaking, eating disorder really refers to one of the diagnoses, the disorders that are categorized in what's called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is kind of what psychologists, therapists, psychiatrists use to diagnose people. So, some of the quote unquote eating disorders would include anorexia, bulimia, there's some other categories too, of different types of eating disorders, but it's kind of like you have to meet the symptoms and criteria of
Okay.
those disorders. And I don't love that whole idea because many people are struggling with their relationship with food and they just don't check all of those categories. We have to remember too that the DSM, is created by medical doctors, I believe. I believe it's entirely psychiatrists. And they don't always get it right. Right. They're humans living in diet culture themselves. They're not always so attuned to the systems that they're operating within. And they can, there's a lot of like weight bias that can be baked in. For example, anorexia nervosa, like, had, traditionally had like a low weight criteria, which is just, we know that that actually most people who are diagnosed, who are struggling with anorexia are not low weight. We
Interesting.
know that. So they get categorized under what's called right now atypical anorexia, which is basically all the criteria of anorexia, but without the low weight criteria. But from research, we know they are just as sick. Actually, there's some studies that suggest that they might be have even more higher level of severity of symptoms and certain things. So, this is also the DSM is also the book that had up until I think like the 1980s had homosexuality as a diagnosable condition, right? So
We're taking it with a grain
it's
of salt.
flawed. Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I think is much more important than if someone meets these criteria based in, some book that a bunch of doctors put out, is how you're feeling. Is, the things that I look at when people come in is like, are you struggling with your relationship with food? Do you think about food and your body like a lot? Does this feel like a preoccupying thing in your life? Does it stop you from doing things that you want to do? Does your eating take up just like a lot of mental space? Are
Mm.
you kind of always thinking about, I should eat that, I shouldn't eat that? Are you experiencing distress around it? Does anything with your eating feel rigid? For example, like if you say, I have to follow, a lot of people ask kind of what's the difference between dieting and disordered eating. And I think
Mm.
that when you get to a place of saying, well, I don't want to, for example, go out to lunch with a friend because they're not going to have foods that are on my diet plan or foods that I feel safe eating, or, I'm going to eat more, or quote unquote, like less healthy, however, whatever that means to you, if I go out for lunch. So like, I'm going to stay home and eat, this food that I have that I feel safe for eating. That's not, a healthy, in my mind, that's not the healthiest relationship with food, because it's preventing you, again, this idea from like engaging fully in your life. It's holding you back.
Mm.
I tell people, like, if they're thinking, sometimes I get people call and say, I'm not sure if I need therapy or not. I'm not sure if this is, severe enough. Exactly what you said. I don't have an eating disorder. I don't meet these criteria, but I think about food a lot, and I, don't, whatever, they go through some things. And I'm like, if you're, you know, questioning whether you might have a disordered relationship with food, there's probably enough going on that warrants treatment. And that's the thing, is like one of the other reasons I really don't like the DSM and the diagnoses of eating disorders is that people tend to think, if I don't have these symptoms and meet one of these criteria, meet one of these diagnoses, I don't need treatment. And if you're struggling and feeling held back by your relationship with food and body image, 100% that's something that should be addressed, because we know that, there are treatments that can help, and you don't need
Mm-hmm.
to like go through life suffering and feeling like crap about your body
Mm-hmm.
when you could feel better. Just like, why deal with that?
It sounds very nice and simple. But I do want to make sure I bring this up, and you touched on it. What do you say to those people that want to talk about weight and dieting in relation to health?
I think we can talk about weight and dieting in relation to health, and we can look at the research and what the science says, and, you know, have a conversation that's about the reality, which is not, like, the research does not support this idea that health is determined by our weight.
Mm.
It's just, the research is just not there. I actually spent the first several years of my career working in quote unquote obesity research. And one of the things that I found was just, it's amazing kind of what goes on between looking at a research study and analyzing, looking at the data of, and like the results of what the researchers found, and what gets disseminated to the general public, because they're two totally different stories.
Mm.
And a lot of the research, which I think is just like, it's amazing that this stuff gets through peer review, because a lot of the research that is showing an association, which doesn't mean a causation, but an association between higher weight and certain health issues, doesn't look at these key factors, such as the role of weight stigma, which we know has a really negative impact on health, the role of weight cycling, losing and gaining
Mm-hmm.
weight, which tends to be what happens with dieting, which we know has a profound impact on health. It doesn't look at the role of marginalization and discrimination. It often doesn't even look at the role of like nutrition and fitness on health. It doesn't look at socioeconomic status. Some do, but not all look at socioeconomic status. And we know that income level is like the most important predictor of health.
Mm.
So
It's an
there's just,
incomplete picture,
it's a
really.
very incomplete picture. It's I think it's worse than an incomplete picture, because it's like an incomplete picture where we're picking out two different things and saying, "Oh, look, here's the answer," rather than,
Because there's money to
yeah,
be made there.
there's a lot of money to be made. And if you look at I mean, one of the things that I find most disturbing around the research on weight and health is the financial interests from the researchers, on the part of the researchers who are being basically paid by the weight loss industry.
Oh, it makes
Yeah,
me
as
my
well as
blood boil.
yeah, it's really disturbing. That was like when I was working in that field, and people would talk so openly about you know, pushing things through, like the whole decision by the American Medical Association to diagnose quote unquote obesity. And I say quotes because it's a stigmatizing term, but I'm going to use it because that's the medical term that people use. When the AMA decided to classify obesity as a disease, it went against the guidelines of its own advisory board, which was saying the science isn't there, the data doesn't support this. And it was heavily influenced by people who were on the committees, who were involved with the pharmaceutical industry, with the weight loss industry. And at the same time that that decision was made, there were 2 new weight loss drugs that were being pushed through. And this decision heavily impacted like how much those drugs were going to be prescribed. It impacted insurance coverage of those drugs. And, you know, there's also like a huge benefit to like industries like the bariatric surgery industry, where, you know, if obesity is a disease, then like more people are going to have bariatric surgery, more doctors are going to refer their patients because now they're treating an illness. It's not just about some, you know, appearance or something like that. So it's all, you know, gets very entrenched. But I'll say this, like after having spent, you know, close to a decade working in obesity research and like staying, I say a decade, but like even after I left my actual research position, I stayed formally, I stayed very involved in like reading all the research. I still try to read a lot of it. And I am not at all convinced that health is determined, you know, by our weight. Yeah. And even if it was, you know, even if you say that it is determined, that health is impacted by our weight, we know that weight is incredible, you know, tends to be pretty stable, and dieting is not effective. There are very few, I would say no ways that we know of, that I know of, to help people lose significant amounts of weight and keep it off long term. So, you know, kind of what are we going to do anyway? Like recommending that people lose weight is going to lead to weight cycling. It's going to lead to increased risk of eating disorders and disordered eating. And what is really the benefit there? The good news is, like when we talk about weight and health, like once we start to recognize that maybe weight doesn't have such a, you know, isn't the determining factor in health, we can look at what are the things that really influence health and focus on those things, which are behaviors and much more under our control. Some of them, you know, again, health, I think that in our culture,
it's so broad, right? It's, I mean, it can, go ahead.
It's so broad. No, and I was just gonna say, like, I think that in our culture where we like have a really big emphasis on self-determination and like everything's about like, you can succeed if you just try hard enough, which is obviously not really true. But, you know, we tend to put a lot of like the sense of personal responsibility on health. And most of the things that have the biggest impact of health are totally out of our control. You know, genetics, by and far the largest influence on health, and income level.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, and you so rarely hear about anything you just said put together in one sentence.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really unfortunate. I mean, and I think that also as you're talking, I'm also wondering, because given the nature of this conversation, given the nature of the work you do, my immediate thought, and I'm sure it is for a lot of people, was first and foremost, how does it relate to me? And secondly, I think the thought goes to, this conversation must be for people who want to lose weight. This conversation must be for people who are considered heavy. I mean, but I feel like there's potentially, and this is where my question is coming in, this whole world of people out there who are societally accepted as in shape, societally accepted as eating a balanced lifestyle, whatever that means to the general population. But I have to imagine there are concerns or problematic aspects of that as well. Like, I feel like potentially someone who is, I'm thinking of someone with a platform that's out there saying, here's what I eat in a day, and here's what I work out and I do in a day, and if you do this, then da 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 da, and we're seeing that person and we're going, wow, she's got it together. But what could you maybe speak to, maybe what's going on potentially behind the scenes for that person. Almost, I don't know if I'm now like putting a lot of words out there that I'm not sure where they all come together, but I'm almost thinking of it like it can't just be the people who have weight to lose that have poor relationships with food. And it can't just be the people that are super, super thin who would have something diagnosable that have a problem or have an issue with food. I don't know.
Yeah.
Can you make sense of what I'm saying?
100%. Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, like, we know that eating disorders don't discriminate by body size, so you can't tell based on, what someone looks like if they're struggling with an eating disorder or not. And body dissatisfaction, body image does not, discriminate by body size. What is different is that, people who are in larger bodies, also are dealing with weight stigma and kind of like the external consequences of living in a world that's confirming that their body is bad and not good enough. And they're, also obviously like very real consequences to weight bias and weight stigma in terms of like discrimination in employment settings, people in larger bodies, like not being able to being hired less frequently, less likely to get promotions, paid less than thinner peers. There's like discrimination in educational settings, and just like the idea of going through life where people are constantly kind of criticizing and pathologizing your body. So that is one thing that I think is different for people in larger bodies. But certainly, like, fat people get eating disorders, thin people get eating disorders. We know that 90%, I think it's like 90% of women are dissatisfied with their body. So that includes, people who are meeting that traditional ideal. One of the things that was so surprising to me. Yeah, 90%. And that, to me, that speaks to the political aspect of it, because when 90% of a group of people are being, believe that they're not good enough, that's not like an individual's issue with body image. I mean, it is in a way, but it's like our culture, it's a society telling us that we're not good enough, and, drinking that in day after day after day. And we see, with that number, with those statistics, that's the consequence that has of living in diet culture.
Yeah, because even now, as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, I want to be in that frame of mind where I'm accepting of myself, and I'm loving myself. Ugh, I can't even say it out loud yet. But I also have this idealized vision of what I want my body to look like and what that will mean for me. And as you're talking, I'm like, it's like, why? And I think, as I'm thinking it through more, it's that maybe in my case, someone may not look at me and go, oh my God, you overweight girl. But I'm thinking it, so that's enough for me to feel my own stigmas and my own shame and weight shame and stigma. And it's the why that is really just giving me a pit in my stomach right now, because I don't know that I like I said, I don't sit down on the couch and go, you're fat. It's just when I walk around the mall, or I am just out in the world, or I'm scrolling social media. It's that comparison. It's what I used to look like 5 years ago. It's what I was praised for and what I'm still praised for when I lose a pound, or I make a choice to have, my sandwich over salad instead of on bread. It's like you get the little pat on the back for doing things like that. And I don't think that's right.
It's not right. And I think that's why, like, the first step to freeing ourselves from this whole thing. Yeah, it's not. It's not. It's totally messed up. And we live in a culture that is like telling us every which way that it's better to be thin. And it takes a lot of resiliency, and we have to kind of open our eyes and recognize like where these messages are coming from, because one of the things is that like all the things that we hope are going to come from losing weight don't always materialize. And one of the things that was most surprising to me when I first started my practice, my therapy practice, and I was talking about like kind of marketing that I'm working with people with um eating issues and with body image concerns. And, I thought that I was going to be working with people mostly in larger bodies. And the first person who came in, I spoke to her on the phone, and I remember she, talked about like the intense shame that she felt about her body, and, could almost like hardly leave the house. She was so disgusted with herself, and, really like just feeling terrible. And she walks into my office and she met every single beauty ideal. She looked like she could have walked off of a, fashion runway or
Yeah.
something. She was, but she felt absolutely terrible about her body. And that's very real,
Yeah.
just because she meets our, and I think that this is this thing is that like the demands from our culture are so incessant that like even if you meet those demands, you still don't feel like you meet those demands. You still don't feel good enough about
Mm.
yourself. And it's kind of like this never ending quest of like, I have to do more, be better. We
Yes.
never like arrive there. I did some research a number of years ago looking at people who get bariatric surgery and how they see their kind of ideal body. And what we find is that people, we ask people to rate kind of where do they see their current body on a scale of different types of bodies, and where they see their ideal body. And we looked at the discrepancy from that. And what we found is that after people had bariatric surgery, which is weight loss surgery, where many people do in the beginning phases lose a dramatic amount of weight, they started, after the procedure, they started marking their current body as smaller, but they started marking their ideal body as smaller
Mm.
than they initially did too. So it became a moving target, and the discrepancy remained this, similar.
Mm.
So, and I think that's what happens like often, is that we say like, well, I just need to like lose, I have to lose weight to feel better about myself. And then maybe we lose some weight and we still don't feel great about ourselves. Like, I just need to lose a little more weight. It has to be more weight. Maybe if I get down to this weight, I'll feel okay. If I get down to this weight, I'll feel okay. And it, can become a really dangerous cycle.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's really hard to live in our dysfunctional culture.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. um, oh man.
But I think the key is to recognize that those thoughts are products of diet culture. Like, the answer isn't actually to change our body. The
Mm.
answer is to change our mindset
Okay,
and
so
to change our culture.
the mindset piece aligns with the mindful eating and intuitive eating. Is that the right how you would talk about that?
So intuitive eating, I teach mindful eating. Intuitive eating and mindful eating, the way that I see them, are very similar and complementary. But intuitive eating really is referencing like the specific principles that are outlined in the book, Intuitive Eating.
I see. Okay.
While mindful eating is based on mindfulness meditation, and but they're both non-restrictive approaches to food that are really about like listening to your body, letting your body guide you, just
Mm-hmm.
kind of slightly different ways of how to get there.
Okay. And then when we talk about changing the culture,
Hmm.
how do we best serve the next generation? Like, you and I have kids. How do we do this with our kids? What do we do?
So
Help me.
in my mind, I get asked this question all the time of like, how do we help our kids? And I really do believe that the most important thing we can do to help our kids have healthy body image is to heal ourselves, is
Mm.
to model that, is to
Mhm.
work through, because we know that one of the most important factors in terms of determining how a child feels about their body is how a parent, I think the research actually looked at mothers, although I think it could apply to any kind of parent, how they feel about their own body. And that
Yeah.
can carry through not only to our children, but to our grandchildren.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
it gets passed down through the generations. And I know, personally, I see this myself, like, that you can look back in my family lineage and see this intense body, dieting and body hatred. And, my grandmother used to talk, disparage her body. My
Mm-hmm.
mother certainly, did this, I grew up listening to those things and a lot of dieting in my home growing up. And, I think that we have the power to break that cycle. So
Mm.
if our kids don't ever hear us criticizing our body, and I think we have to, it's not just about what we say, it has to be an internal change, because even if we say, well, I'm just not going to talk badly about my body in front of my kids, they sense it, it slips out, it kind of, they get what's going on. But I think when we truly can try to heal, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but, be, again, it's that awareness, aware of
Yeah.
the negative things we're saying and trying to change that, our kids get that message too.
Yeah. I mean, kids are
So
so intuitive in that
they
way. I
are.
mean, they're so
Yeah.
responsive. They just things click for them and you don't even realize.
Hmm.
And I'm
Yeah.
thinking of my own experience in childhood, and I will say that I think that my mom had the best of intentions in that anything really generally that I can remember as being talked about in our house when it came to weight or food came from this place of the health perspective. Maybe she read a bunch of books on sugar, or and that was the conversation. Or there were certain aspects of, I always had the understanding that it was to better our health and better our body, but I was not unaware of the fact that there was a level of weight maintenance involved there. I mean, my mom is very naturally petite and small, and worked out a lot, and I feel like it can be a fine line of doing and saying when it comes to weight and exercise and body image when you're dealing with a kid, because I can say now that I didn't always have the awareness of where she was coming from, or how I was going to interpret it. And just seeing even her, if it is, I'm fumbling over my words now, but I know from her perspective, she was trying to educate herself on what would be best for her and what would be best for her kids. But maybe what she missed is how, as a kid, I was interpreting that, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think that, again, like, we're all products of diet culture. So, I
Mm-hmm.
don't want this to come off at all as like blaming parents or blaming, our moms. Certainly,
Yeah.
motherhood is hard as heck. And,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think we do the best that we can. And hopefully, if our kids feel loved, everything else can kind of sort itself out.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think that whether we're putting these kind of rules around food for health because we're saying it's about health, or we're saying it's about weight, it doesn't make a huge difference. Like, it's all kind of the messaging that gets internalized that, like, these foods are good, these foods are bad. Kids often hear that as like, I'm bad if I want these foods
Yes.
because these foods are bad. It
Mm-hmm.
can set the stage for, cycles of disordered eating for kids when we restrict what they're eating, because they're much more likely to sneak the foods or eat it at a friend's house and then feel guilty about it. And it's like, they're kids. Like, food eating should be simple. It should just be, like, I don't want my kids to ever feel anything about food other than just like they're eating, they're enjoying it, and then they're
Yeah.
moving on with their life.
Yeah.
Like, the last thing I want is for, my kids to be even thinking about a meal after it ends. Like, the
Mm-hmm.
idea is like, I always like love watching my kids eat, and like, especially at like a birthday party or something, where they, like, oftentimes they eat, they'll have the pizza, they'll have the cake, they eat until they're satisfied, but then they go and want to, go jump on the bouncy house or go like run around with their friends. And that's what childhood is about.
Mm-hmm.
Food shouldn't be such a focal point. But I think that when parents start to try to control what their kids are eating, and, like, we we're very personally, and again, I don't work, I'm not like a child
Right.
therapist, so I don't work a lot with kids, but like the approach we have in our house is we don't have like good foods or bad foods. We, mimic, again, this is where like your own philosophy will filter down to your kids. Like I trust my body to guide me in eating foods that are enjoyable, stopping when I've had enough, and, eating when I'm hungry, nourishing myself. Like, and I trust my kids' bodies to do the
Mm-hmm.
same. So, we don't, like we don't, there's no foods that are really off limits. I mean, obviously there's some foods that we as a family buy and some that we don't, just based on preferences and things
Mm-hmm.
like that. But, um,
Feels like
I
kids would
like,
almost be better at it than adults because they haven't
oh, totally.
necessarily had the years and years of buildup behind this food and the industry and the thoughts and the this. They just live, right? Like they're just like, that tastes good, I want more of it. you
Yeah.
know
And I think that security, for food, like food security in terms of even just like knowing that these foods will always be available to them is really important.
yeah.
So, my kids know, like if they're at a birthday party and having a slice of cake, like that's not the last time they're going to have cake.
Yeah.
Right? They'll have, they can have ice cream if they want later on. If they really wanted cake, we could go get them a slice of cake from somewhere. Like they have access to those foods. And I think the same thing with adults is like we have to be able to trust that we can have the foods that we enjoy when we want them.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we do feel compelled to eat it all when we have the chance, because like who knows when we're gonna have it again.
Yeah, I totally do
For
that.
people, yeah, well, yeah, and it's
When
super
I was
common.
pregnant too, that happened a lot. And
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I wasn't quote unquote allowed to eat that before, but that's what I'm going to eat now.
Yeah, super common with pregnancy too, because it's like a time where a lot of people who are restricting a lot, prior to pregnancy kind of give themselves more leniency with those rules and allow themselves, but there is that kind of last meal mentality where it's like, well, I can eat this now, but I won't be able to have it
yeah.
again. So that's why a non-restrictive approach to food, that's what I teach, is so important. It's really about like letting go of these rules around good foods or bad foods, healthy foods, unhealthy foods, and just trying to tune into like, what do you enjoy? Again, using mindfulness and mindful eating to tune into what do you enjoy? What does your body want? How does your body react to certain foods? Because the idea of like even healthy foods or unhealthy foods, like what's healthy for one person is going to be totally different from like
Mm-hmm.
what works well for another person, because our bodies are all unique. But I do want to add, for any parents or people with little ones in their life who might be listening, division of responsibility is a philosophy that is often recommended for people who have like want more guidance on child feeding. It's kind of like similar to intuitive eating or mindful eating, but for the version for kids.
Okay. Okay. I'm just going to make a note of that. Um, yeah, it's tough. I think it's tough as a parent to put your own your own mess aside.
No, I just want to emphasize is that like we don't have to do it perfectly. I think it's all about intention
Mm.
and learning and trying our best. And there's so many great books and resources available on like healing our own relationship with food and healing our kids' relationship with food, or just not messing up
Mm-hmm.
and just supporting them in what they already know.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that kids are resilient too, as much impact as we have on their relationship with food and body. Like if we don't always do it perfectly, kids are also resilient and we have other chances to try to, adjust course.
Yes. And I know what I wanted to make sure I brought up because it was something that in listening to you speak in other interviews that really stuck out for me was that, and it reminded me of it because of kids. I think there is also this thought that as adults, if we say, okay, I'm going to just really listen to my body, I think we fear, or I don't know, fear is the right word. You have probably more elaborate words to use for it, but I think that there's this thought that we're going to then all of a sudden just be a person who wants birthday cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And it reminded me of that with kids because, you know, my kid has sweets and then she's done with it. Like, she doesn't want them all the time, you know? And I think that this has to be the same for adults. You know, maybe you do have a week when you first decide to go down this path that, yeah, you want cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But at some point, you're probably going to want a salad. You're probably going to want something that isn't chocolate or something like that, you know? And I don't know. Do you find that, is that the case?
Yeah, so I think that that's like one of fear or scary is like a great word. I think that describes it perfectly. Like, it's scary when we spent so much of our lives mistrusting our bodies to say, okay, I'm going to be
Yeah.
able to eat whatever I want because we've internalized this idea of like, if I'm not trying to fight against my, unruly instincts, I'm going to be like eating cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Um, but and this is a really common concern that I have with clients. I address it in the book as well, because I think that most people kind of on the precipice of like, oh, should I let go of dieting? Like, what does that mean? I'm just going to eat in a way that feels out of control. Have this fear. And, a lot of the fear, first of all, like I'll say, comes from times where people say, well, I've gone off dieting before. I've tried to like allow myself to eat what I want and it's felt out of control. And oftentimes what happens is that when we say, screw the diet, I'm just going to eat whatever, we aren't actually eating exactly what we want. We're eating everything that we weren't supposed to have when we were dieting.
Yeah.
Right. So
that's a really, really important distinction, I think, to make.
Yeah. Because that's just as misattuned to our body as dieting, right? Like, it's both, it's whether we're following the rules or just doing the opposite of the rules, neither is really mindful. And so mindful eating is really about like reacquainting ourselves with our bodies and starting to hear, what it is that we actually want. It's a process, and it can be scary, which is one of the reasons that in my book, I try to break it down into steps so that people feel supported as you're going through. It's not this vague, eat what you want when you want. And people are like, how do I do that? What does that mean? Because that can be really scary. But I will say, it's most people are like, oh my gosh, I'm going to like eat in a way that feels out of control. This is going to be a disaster.
Yeah.
And sometimes there is a period of time where if we think about a pendulum, the pendulum kind of swings in the other direction. If we've been restricting a lot of foods, when we let go of those restrictions, the pendulum can swing, and there can be a period of time where we're like, oh my God, I'm allowed to have cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm going to have cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And like we do. And that's usually the point where people come back to me and they're like, why'd you tell me to do this? This is a disaster. What are you talking about? But the biggest mistake that people can make is giving up at that point, because they're in the middle of it. And if you keep going and keep allowing yourself to have cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, everyone that I've ever worked with, I don't want to say this is like universal, because obviously I'm working with a smaller, I'm not working with the entire world's population, but like, everyone that I've seen, like eventually things recalibrate. So, there comes a point, after whether it's days of eating cake for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, weeks, a month, whatever it is, when people are like, oh, I don't want cake anymore. I feel so sick. Like, I'm so tired of this damn cake. I don't want to look at it. And, you start to say, oh, okay, maybe I want a salad. Maybe I want a piece of, fish. Maybe I want some soup or whatever, because our body naturally craves like diverse different foods. That's, through evolution, we've been primed to crave diversity in our diet because we need to get like different kinds of nutrients. And we're not getting that from eating the same thing, 3 meals a day. So if once the chatter kind of quiets down around the anxiety of like, will I be able to have this food again? And we start to trust, I can always have cake whenever I want it. When do I actually want it? Do I want it right now? Am I in the mood for it? Things start to stabilize, and we start to find like, no, actually, like we're usually not in the mood for cake 24 hours a day.
And you mentioned how that might make initially someone feel out of control, but now hearing you come talk about what happens kind of at the other side, I don't know if there is anything more empowering than that, than really having that confidence and that security to, Yeah, I mean, it's not because it's not a fun place to be when what you're about to eat or not eat is just at the forefront of your mind all the time.
Yeah. And that's,
It's
I
exhausting.
think it really is. It's exhausting. It's can be pretty miserable.
Yeah.
Um, and the journey, to get from that place where you're thinking about food all the time and beating yourself up for what you eat to a place of mindful eating, feeling more free in your relationship with food, like there can be some messy points to get, we kind of have
Hmm.
to like walk through some swampy areas to get there. But if you keep going, you do get to the other side. And I think that empowering is really one of the intentions that I have in terms of like doing this work, because I think that when we're able to kind of opt out of diet culture, obviously it's always going to be surrounding us, but when we're able to build resiliency and say like, I am good enough right now exactly as I am, regardless of what, my weight or what, society tells me is an acceptable size, we start to participate more in the world and engage more fully. And like that is radical, I think, to get, if we look at 90% of women are not feeling good about their body, if we get those 90% of women to actively, be more fully engaging in the world, like that's going to be a different place that we're looking at.
Oh my goodness. Oh, I just gotta chill. I mean, it's so true. Like how many women are sitting there just not even tapping into their full potential because they're afraid of what judgment is going to come upon them for how they look when they walk outside the door or enter a
Exactly.
workplace or speak up. Oh my goodness. Okay,
Exactly.
and if you don't mind me asking, I know that you've come to this work in part because diet culture was not working for you and you wanted to
Mhm.
explore that further. At this point in your career and in the work that you're doing, are you happy? Do you feel like you personally have a handle on this, or how would you describe your experience kind of now working through this for as long as you have?
So I think that, it's not about, I don't think any, I don't think that it's about feeling happy all the time. And I don't think it's about never struggling with your relationship with your body or with food. Certainly like my body, like a lot of people, has gone through changes, especially over the past 2 years between having a baby and also, the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say there were never times where I was like, "Oh, what's going on here?" But what I will say is that I feel that I have resilience. That I look at that and I say, "Okay, that is a product of diet culture." I'm having those thoughts because we live in a world that reinforces that thinner is better. That is, maybe judging the changes that my body has gone through. But I know fundamentally, like my body's doing the best that it can. My body just birthed a baby, and bodies are meant to change, and this is what my body is doing right now. My body is surviving a pandemic, my
Hmm.
body is coping with a lot of stress this year, or whatever is going on. um so I think it's not about like everything being happy and perfect and sunshine and rainbows all the time, but the resiliency and self-compassion that we can build to be able to recognize, okay, I'm having a hard time right now. How can I, care for myself a little bit better?
Hmm.
How can I, you
Grace.
know, yeah, exactly. Grace, resiliency. I think we're talking about the same kinds of
Yeah.
things.
Okay. I was just curious. Thank you for answering that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
But I don't think that body image is ever, a lot of people are like, well, how do I heal body image, or how do I get to this place? I don't know if it's ever like the end of the road, but, I will say that like, I don't feel that, you know, I think that the intent, like a great place to get to is where you don't feel held back by these thoughts,
mm,
where, maybe they pop up every now and then, but they are certainly not like the focal point of,
yeah.
of your life. They're not, most of the day you're going through just kind of like doing more important
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess lastly, is there anything that you would have asked yourself that I didn't, or anything that you want to make sure we get in here today that I didn't think to mention?
No, I mean, I think that, some of the most important things that I would kind of leave people with is the idea to really start to recognize like the problem is not your body. The problem is our culture. And when we can place our anger and our, kind of mistrust on what the actual issue is and like dedicate our energy to trying to change diet culture and fight against diet culture versus fighting against ourselves.
Yeah.
I think that becomes, a lot more productive battle to be
Yeah.
fighting.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because you know what? If we can all, I mean, just the only thing, the thought that's going through my head is like women, man, like just women.
Yeah.
If we could all just get behind the same cause, we could really, really change things.
Hmm.
Well,
Yeah. And
and
I think we
you're
can.
starting it. I mean, you are, and we just all have to kind of. We can start with your book, and we can start by having more of these conversations. And I don't know. I think a lot of it is awareness.
It is. I think a lot of it is awareness. I'm certainly not the first person to be saying these things. There's a lot of,
Mm-hmm.
especially people in marginalized bodies who've been fighting this fight for longer than I've been alive.
Yeah.
And, one of the things I really recommend is like following those folks on social media, reading their books too,
Mm-hmm.
learning from people with lived experience. I think that a lot of the times people are more comfortable hearing these things from someone who looks like me with a lot of privileges. But it's
Yeah.
also really important to hear from people who have really lived it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. And thank you for your time. This was wonderful. I feel I feel metaphorically lighter and just I personally feel like I have a better understanding and kind of a place to start. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
I left this conversation outraged, moved, motivated, and unsure where to start. Thankfully, that is where Dr. Conason's book comes in handy. If you're feeling the same, I encourage you to start there. Order her book, The Diet-Free Revolution. I'm not sure if you can hear it, but I can hear how I'm not only asking Dr. Conason questions, but I'm actively processing the information in real time. This was and still is a bit of a heavily weighted topic for me. In the time since I interviewed Dr. Conason, my own findings have been that I simply do not value feeding myself, and therefore do not eat enough. Feeding myself is last on the list of priorities, and truthfully, I often feel it a waste of time. So, I've learned that I'm also a distracted eater, in that I'm always eating while performing another task. As I mentioned before the interview, there are more conversations coming out about this with Caitlin Parsons, Uime Agota, and Erica Drury, and you will hear the progression of my journey unfold throughout those episodes. And I'm sure you'll continue to do so over time and over the course of more interviews that I book. But for now, start with Dr. Conason's book. Slow down and listen to the way that you talk to yourself about food, about your body, about exercise, and question what you hear yourself saying. Open your eyes and see how diet culture is embedded in most aspects of our lives, and question it. Start to think about what works for you and what doesn't. Think about how you want your kids to think about food, body, and exercise. It may seem simple, but I can tell you that prior to these interviews, I really didn't do that. I didn't stop when I heard myself speaking negatively to myself. I didn't stop when I saw ads on social media or out in the world promoting, what these beauty ideals and the body types, and I just sort of took them for, yeah, that's life. But stop and question them. Because in my experience, a lot of what I've uncovered is surprising to me and unexpected and certainly part of the journey. So, all right, that's it. Dr. Conason, you're a rock star. If you need my help in the future changing the world, I'm here. Just let me know. See you next time. Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Sass Says is a production of Luann Nigara, Inc. This podcast is meant to be educational and not meant to replace professional therapy or professional medical attention. To learn more about today's show and what's new in my world, head over to sasssays.com. Thanks so much. Talk later.